Be seated, everybody, and Shabbat Shalom. It's so good to see you here, and as much as I've loved being outside for the obvious reasons, I love being back in our sanctuary. I mean, isn't it great? There's something just special about being in the sanctuary, and one of the cool things, Zoom folks, is I can see you guys again on the back screen, so that's really cool. So I'm really excited about the things we're doing here to make this space safe and comfortable for everyone. So keep us posted, and we'll give you some feedback, and there'll be some communication this week about what indoor services will look like going forward as the weather has shifted, and we're now in the winter season. So, okay, well, let's jump in today. Today, I want to go back to our study on the book of Ephesians. And if you have Bibles, if you'd open to Ephesians chapter 4, that's where we are. And so there are some Bibles. Does anyone need a Bible in the back? They're right out there at the back. Otherwise, you can just follow along. Now, if you remember, I started a message series on Ephesians last spring, and then paused with camp and then the High Holy Days. So I'm excited to jump back in to finish the book. Today will be the fifth message in the series. And so if you've missed 1 through 4 or would like to go back, they are on the website. So you can go back there. And the idea is that eventually we'll have the whole book covered on the website, which will be like a goal that we can do. I won't take time to review too much, except just to say that big picture, the book of Ephesians is a letter where the Apostle Paul instructs us as a community how to live out our shared life in Yeshua together. In Ephesians, we've seen that spiritual maturity means healthy relationships where we live out God's great plan for reconciliation with each other every day. We have to put aside our old identity and selfishness and greed and take on Messiah's identity inside of our community. Humility, gentleness, patience, putting up with one another in love, giving of our gifts and passions and talents to build one another up and to advance the community of Messiah. Today, I've been kind of looking forward to doing this message for some time. Today, I want to zero in on how to manage anger from the book of Ephesians. It's a critical part of healthy community life, is managing anger and dealing with this. So let's pick up where we left off. Verse 25. We're at verse 25. Chapter 4, verse 25. So lay aside lying, each one of you. Speak truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry, yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, nor give the devil a foothold. The one who steals must steal no longer. Instead, he must work, doing something useful with his own hands so that he may have something to share with the one who has need. Let no harmful word come out of your mouth, but only what is beneficial for building others up according to the need, so that it gives grace to those who hear it. Do not grieve the Ruach HaKodesh of God, the Spirit of God, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Get rid of all bitterness and rage and anger and quarreling and slander, along with all malice. Instead, be kind to one another, compassionate, forgiving each other just as God and Messiah has forgiven you. What sticks out in this beautiful passage to me is Paul's emphasis on anger. Anger is a real problem for Paul. It's a powerful statement. Do not grieve the Ruach HaKodesh of God with anger. Here, anger not only leads to sin, it gives Satan a stronghold in your life. Angry actions he identifies like hurtful words, slander, fighting, malice. They all tear a person down, they damage relationships, and they rip apart communities. Paul is right. Anger poisons communities. Anger poisons families. Anger poisons relationships, and anger poisons our own soul. Psalm 37:9 reads, "Put away anger and turn from wrath. Throw it out. Proverbs 22:24 instructs us, do not even be friends with one who is given to anger or associate with a hot-tempered person. 1 Timothy 2:8, in every place the men should lift their hands in prayer without anger and without quarreling. Paul tells us that anger grieves the Holy Spirit. It's very strong. It grieves the Holy Spirit, our anger, lessening the impact of God in our life. And in my experience in working with families, anger in the home is often what destroys families and destroys marriages and cripples children with angry parents. And yet, here's the thing. Just about all of us here wrestle with anger of some sort, don't we? I mean, maybe you don't, but I do. We all do. We all wrestle with anger. I think many people misunderstand anger. So let's pause for a moment, and let's talk about the emotion of anger and see if we can unpack this a little bit more. Paul highlights that there are different kinds of anger. I find it helpful to see anger more like a spectrum of emotions than one single emotion. We can call it the angry spectrum. The angry spectrum. On the one side is irritation, and then on the other side is rage. Irritation, rage. Irritation and annoyance are simply mild forms of anger. Still included in this list that Paul's talking about. Frustration is maybe a rung up. It depends how you define it. Maybe we could say frustration is anger when something doesn't go as you would hope. That's frustration. Then on the other side of the angry spectrum is rage. Rage is anger that's out of control. Rage is anger that is out of control. In Ephesians, Paul covers this spectrum. Let no harmful word come out of your mouth. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, quarreling, slander, along with malice. Malice is maybe anger with the intention to do evil. See, slander and hurtful language, anger expressed in our words. We might say that bitterness is internalized anger as a lifestyle. Internalized anger as a lifestyle. If we're going to work on anger, we need to understand these different kinds. And my experience is that we need to pay close attention to the milder forms of anger, like irritation and frustration, as these are often the seeds of what later turn into the more dangerous forms of anger, like bitterness and rage. Often a person's fuse from mild irritation to rage is quite short. Of course, we want to make it longer, bigger. Over time, a person who is often annoyed and often irritated becomes a bitter person. That person has an anger problem, not all unlike a person who struggles with, outward forms of anger and anger outbursts. If you want to know whether you struggle with an anger problem, the best way is to ask the people who live with you in your house. That's the best way, because most people have an anger problem. A lot of them don't see it, until you can see it. Ask the people in your house that you live with every day, your wife, your husband, maybe your ex-wife or your ex-husband, your children, your brothers, your sisters. Ask them. Now, the tension is that when we talk about anger, sometimes it seems right to be angry, and sometimes it seems wrong to be angry. You see, some people use the term righteous anger. You guys have heard that, righteous anger. I don't really like it. I think what we mean by righteous anger is that the thing a person is angry at is really, really wrong, and therefore it's right to get angry at this thing. Anger seems like the righteous response. After all, God gets angry in the Bible. Yeshua gets angry at injustice. Just look at what we read today. He's angry at the injustice of what's happening in the temple, and he goes and he makes a whip and drives everything over, and its zeal consumes him. You see? So there's something going on here. He's filled with zeal. We're called upon to care about injustice and wrong in our lives, whether it's global injustice or the injustice that happens in our day-to-day lives. And perhaps we should even be angered by it, if I could say. But at the same time, the Bible has verses and verses about the dangers of anger. And many of you have experienced, I'm sure, the destruction left by an angry person who justifies rage at the many seeming injustices of everyone around him or her. Or when a person makes a disparaging comment out of resentment because of the wrongs done in the past. Or when a person expresses that their righteous anger by withdrawing their presence as a punishment, the silent treatment. The anger of unforgiveness is toxic, no matter how unjust the action. A child who doesn't listen has a problem, but angry yelling is never the righteous solution to that problem. So I don't like the term righteous anger versus unrighteous anger. Let's pause again and talk about emotions more generally. See, God gave us emotions. Emotions are healthy. Emotions are good. Emotions are like the eyes to the heart. They provide us with information about life. They connect us with people. When we feel sad, it shows us that we've lost something of value. When we feel guilty, it shows us that we've done something wrong and we need to make it right. When we feel anxious, it reminds us that we have a burden that might need our attention. When we feel joy, it points us towards heavenly things, you see? And emotions help us to see into each other's hearts. Emotional intelligence is the sensitivity to understand and to read other people's emotions, which gives us critical information about how to interact with other people around us. So being able to go into a room and sense other people's emotions to know how to act and how to respond is critical for healthy relationships, isn't it? So emotions are good. They're a gift from God, just like our eyes. And they're not something that we want to remove, but they all have a purpose. Emotions are designed to pass through our hearts, give us this information, and then go. They're designed to pass through our hearts, give us this information, and move on. See, when our emotions stay in our hearts, maybe with the exception of joy or peace, it might be the only two I would make an exception with here. But when our emotions stay in our hearts, they simmer, and then they collide together and create chaos and confusion, and that's when bad things happen. So we need to learn how to take the information from our emotions, process it, and then let the emotions go. The same is true with anger. The emotion of anger isn't righteous or unrighteous. It's a God-given emotion that's intended to give us information. Anger tells us there's a problem that we need to address. When we try to solve the problem using anger, that's when we sin. When we try to solve the problem with anger, we sin. Now, when we don't process anger correctly, it becomes toxic. Undealt with anger will cause inner chaos with our emotions, like I said, causing them to collide together. The result can be uncontrolled anxiety, depression, ups and downs, all kinds of problems. That's why Paul tells us, do not let the sun go down on your anger, nor give the devil a foothold. Ecclesiastes 7:9, do not be quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the hearts of fools. It's a strong verse, excuse me. Don't let your anger settle in your heart. Flee from it quickly, because if you hold on to it, it will allow Satan to destroy your life. That's Paul's message, very strong. Emotions are actually physiological. They're produced by hormones and chemicals, and that's the way God made us. So overreactive emotions eventually lead to physiological and chemical imbalances that we can actually measure. You go to the doctor and they can tell you have this particular problem because you have too much of this or too much of that. And so, let alone our relationships, they actually do poison our minds. They can actually poison our minds. And of course, we live in a broken world, and sometimes people seem to be born with these imbalances. You know, it's just like a part of it. We don't know why. Which means a person just needs to be even more intentional about working on cultivating and healthy relationships in their life, healthy emotions in their life. Verse 26 is really interesting. The way the TLV that we read today translates it, be angry yet do not sin. Now this verse, I don't think is giving permission to be angry as a state of being. The NIV translates this as, in your anger don't sin. We might even translate it as, do not sin by holding on to anger. Do not sin by acting in your anger. Do not even let the sun go down, it continues, while you're angry. Paul may be drawing off Proverbs 29:22. One given to anger causes much sin. See? James also picks up on this in the first chapter of his letter, chapter 1:20. Be quick to listen and slow to get angry, for the anger of a man does not produce the righteousness of God. It doesn't lead to righteous actions if you act out of your anger. So when the Torah speaks of the sin of anger, I don't think it's referring to the passing emotion. I think it's referring to the action of the emotion. The sin of anger is not the emotion. Anger is simply a diagnostic tool. It tells us there's a problem, like a warning flag that goes up. Problem. And we sin when we use anger as the tool to solve our problem. We sin when we use anger as a tool to solve our problem. Sin is the harsh word. It's the snarky comment. It's the passive silent treatment. It's the withdrawal. It's the irritated sigh. It's the rolling of the eyes. The passive-aggressive behavior, even stewing in anger to secretly punish someone as a form of revenge. We need to internalize this. Anger tells us there's a problem we need to solve, but anger is not the solution to the problem. Anger is great at identifying problems, not good at solving them. It is wise to work on anger, whether it's the slightest irritation or frustrations to the more severe anger outbursts. I think it's critical that we develop a plan so that we can be intentional about it. Today, what I want to do as we close today, I want to just lay out one sort of big picture of what a plan looks like. And then next week, I want to do this as 2 parts. We'll talk about how to practically work on anger in a specific area of your life to make this really practical and on the ground so that we can actually make a change. So in the general framework here, which will set the stage for next week, the first thing you need to do with anger, whether it's irritation or whether it's bitterness or whether it's something bigger, is that when you feel the hint of anger, you need to stop. The first step is stop. And so in Paul's language, in your anger, do not sin. Let no harmful word come out of your mouth. Put it off. Flee from it. See, stop. Anger is very strong. It's very strong emotional intensity. Think of it like energy. It moves quickly, and we have to master it. Paul says this in other areas. We have to master it. We have a funny family memory. A few years ago, I was teaching our kids about anger during one of our family devotional times, and it was over breakfast, and I brought a large tomato out and placed it in the middle of the table, which is odd for breakfast, just to create some curiosity. And then as we were talking about anger and how it's emotional energy that could come and swell up within, I took the tomato and just squeezed it, and it burst open, and it went all over everywhere, and the guts were over everybody. It was on my face and on my clothes, and it hit the ceiling, and we still have a stain on the ceiling from this. I didn't intend for it to be so dramatic, but it was great. It was terrific. And we all laughed for a long time. And the idea is that our task is to catch anger at the first hint, and then do whatever we can to keep it from exploding and pouring its guts around everyone, in our life. So before you yell, before you hit something, before you throw something, before you slam the door, before you storm off, before you sigh, before you make that comment, before you make that little glance that everyone knows what it is. Even those subtle anger cues can be damaging. These silent messages we can give to one another that shouts your anger. You see? You can take a break. If you're in an argument or a conflict, always say, I'm getting angry, I need to take a break, and then you got to add this. You have to add this. I'll be back in a few minutes. It's going to be okay. You see? I'm coming back. I got to take a break. I'll be back. It's going to be okay. You got to add that. Otherwise, it'll just be interpreted as storming off in anger, which will cause all kinds of other problems. Get a glass of water. Some of these things. Find out what works. Walk around a little. Get on your knees and pray. Whatever you need to do to let it out without acting on it. And I don't like techniques that tell you to go scream in the woods or punch your pillow. I don't like those for anger management. It's counterproductive because it reinforces a false belief that your anger needs to be released through an angry action. This is not true. That's not Paul's model. Paul's model is to put it off, to send it away, stop and force it to go through without taking an angry action. So that's our second Our first one is stop. The second part of this plan is to identify the problem. This is where anger management plans often stop. They often tell you to stop getting angry, but then you just leave it, and you never solve the problem that you have, and you just get angry again. So once you've settled down, you need to move onto the second step, which is to identify the real problem. Anger is like a warning flag. Remember, something is wrong. Now, you become like a detective searching for clues for what the real problem is. Now, speaking practically, one of the reasons I think why many people get angry is because they don't actually have the tools or the solutions to deal with their larger emotions and life's problems, and then they feel stuck and cornered, and then they react in their anger. Are we passing out the supplies? Okay. And then we feel stuck. Does that make sense? So what happens is if we don't have the tools, you ever felt like you're hemmed in? You don't have the tools, you don't know what to do, so you get angry. You see, you need the tools. So when we work on anger in our lives, it's critical that our plan includes real solutions to the specific problems that we're facing. Otherwise, anger will just keep coming back. So let me share with you a list of some common reasons why people might feel angry, because it's helpful to go back and try to identify, where is this really coming from? This list actually is from Scott Taransky's book called Good and Angry, which is just a terrific book on anger in the families. The first category here is physical pain. Often when we stub our toe, how many of you say something you wish you didn't say? You get an anger reaction. This is something that's happened to me. A child jumps on dad when he's not looking, and it hurts, and he might, immediately, hey, cut it out, and get angry because of that, because of physical pain. Blocked goals. Obviously, traffic when you're already late for an appointment that you really cared about, getting on time for. For me, it's I've lost my keys and my shoes and my this and my that, and I'm already late, and something gets in the way of a blocked goal that we have. We want to do something, and we can't do it because of something else. 3 is violated rights. I remember feeling terribly angry one time in high school. I was falsely accused of cheating on a test, and my rights were violated, and I was burning with anger. Now, the problem with violated rights is that it's not always that the rights are actually violated, but it might be that someone has a false belief that their rights were violated. A husband may feel that he has the right to some peace and quiet at home and gets angry at being nagged and bothered about helping out in the kitchen. Do you see? Unfairness. This is a big one for me. When I see someone hurting someone else, I feel angry. Children will often get angry when they feel like they aren't treated fairly or when someone else is mean. Unmet expectations or disappointment. A wife expected that her husband would come home on time, but he stayed at work late and didn't call. A dad expected his son to help with the yard work, but instead he played video games inside. These are reasons people get angry, unmet expectations. So physical pain, blocked goals, violated rights, unfairness, unmet expectations. These are things you can come back to. Now, these are categories. There might be others too. Sometimes people just have a deep-seated anger inside that isn't linked to one particular problem. But even here, we call it generalized anger, usually links itself to specific problems throughout your life, doesn't it? And you can still get a lot of traction working on these problems and solving them very specifically, and actually helps the bigger picture. So what we need to do is we need to ask, simple, why am I angry? I'm feeling disappointed. Why am I angry? I was wronged. I wanted it to be one way, and something got in the way. And then once we figure out this problem, we need to determine whether the problem is an internal problem or an external problem. This is really important for anger management. Is it an internal problem or is it an external problem? Because that affects the solution. It's very circumstantial. So let's go through some examples so you get a sense for what I'm talking about. Mom stubs her toe and gets angry. That's an internal problem, right? It's not, I'm sorry, forgive me. It's an internal problem because it's not like someone else did something to her. Her solution might be an internal solution. Practice patience. That's her solution. Now, if she'd stubbed her toe because her son left a toy in the middle of the hallway when she asked him not to, then it becomes an external problem. And her tendency would be to get angry at her child. But anger isn't going to help. Her solution might require more training with her kids. You see, so that's a different solution. A child jumps on dad and gets angry, that one there. It's an external problem. The child needs to learn to ask before jumping on dad. But the dad shouldn't use anger to solve his problem. It won't help. It'll make things worse. The child might need training of some kind, maybe in the area of sensitivity to other people's needs, maybe in the area of, various different things, awareness. Anger becomes the flag that tells dad that he needs to work on this problem with his son. Totally different than an anger response. Anger from traffic could be internal or external. If you were on time, prepared, and then there's an accident that sets you back, then it's an external, it's a problem that doesn't have to do with something it becomes an internal problem that doesn't have to do with someone outside of you. It's to do with how are you going to deal with this problem. Your solution here could be, again, to practice patience, or maybe to reevaluate your priorities. Maybe where you're going shouldn't be quite as high on the value list for you, so that you can let it go when something gets in the way. That would help. But let's say you're already late because you couldn't find your keys or your shoes and this and that. You were running around like crazy. And, then anger becomes a flag that says, well, you have an internal problem. You need to work on better organization. You see the difference? So we're looking at how to solve the problem based on where the anger lands. Falsely accused of cheating. It was an external problem that, required healthy conversation to happen. But then it had an inside part to it because I had developed a reputation in high school where that could have easily been the case. You see? So that was other problems there. If someone has a meanness problem and says a harsh word, the solution is not anger. The solution might be firm confrontation and communication. The wife who's angry with her husband who stayed home late and didn't call might have an external problem. She needs to have a healthy conversation about her needs with her husband. But she might have an internal problem. She might not recognize or realize the extent and the weight and what's going on for her husband, and she might need to adjust her own expectations. You see, finding out what the problem is to solve it. What I'm trying to do by sharing all of these things, I know it's a lot, it's just regular life examples to show how critical it is that after we've stopped our anger, the process of figuring out the specifics and problem solving in healthy ways. And then the last step is that you need to choose a solution to the problem that doesn't involve anger. And you need to go through life and work through each little situation that you have and create little plans for each situation. That's something we could talk about next time. Now, for generalized anger, a significant anger problem, you first want to allow anger to transition into sadness about the problem, especially with abuse and other things like that. Anger transitions to sadness because anger tends to harden the heart, builds walls up between people. Sadness softens the heart and opens the heart for comfort, which is a key ingredient for healing and forgiveness. So it might be a firm conversation. I think Yeshua's solution for the temple problem was to go and make a whip and turn over the tables with zeal. That was the solution he used. I wouldn't use that solution because I'm not Yeshua, very rarely. But it could be. It might mean listening. It might mean getting help, seeking a counselor. It might mean working on an internal problem like time management or changing your own unrealistic expectations. It might mean ignoring the problem and moving on. Proverbs 12:16 says, "Fools show their annoyance at once, but the prudent overlooks an insult." It will always mean prayer. So the goal in an anger plan is not to get rid of emotions. The goal is to learn how to use them in practical ways that God intended them to be used. And in a general sense, Paul gives us a solution in his passage for anger in his letter that we can always come back to, even if we don't know what the problem was. He says, don't sin in your anger, it will grieve the Spirit of God. In verse 32, instead, be kind to one another, compassionate, forgive each other just as God and Messiah also forgave you. See, Paul knew that the very opposite end of the anger spectrum, if you go all the way, is love. That's the opposite of anger. And even if we can't always diagnose the problem, when we practice love in our lives, it displaces anger. Paul tells us that we really need to reduce our anger by practicing love. And how do we practice love? Kindness, compassion, forgiving each other just as Messiah forgave you. You do things of kindness. And I'll close with bringing this back around to Paul's big point, which is that we're not only to become masters of anger as individuals, but we need to become healthy communities where we learn how to solve life's problems with healthy and godly solutions, and we never let anger gain a foothold. So I will leave it there for this week, and next week we'll learn how to craft a specific targeted plan for an issue that will, I think, could potentially change lives because it really works. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone.